Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to It Says What, where JW3 and Limmud come together to bring you unexpected texts from across the Jewish tradition. If you haven't been to JW3, we are the UK's Jewish Community and Art Centre. We're currently closed, but we're offering a wide and varied online program, and we're partnering to bring you this program with Limmud, a diverse and inclusive worldwide community of Jewish learning. This series will ask educators, artists, and leaders from across the Jewish community in the UK and abroad to share a surprising or unexpected piece of Jewish wisdom for our time. You're able to ask your own questions. If you're in the webinar, you can do that through the Q&A feature at the bottom, or if you're on Facebook or YouTube, you can ask questions there as well, and we'll take them towards the end of the event. I am delighted this week to welcome Rabbi Michael Pollak, a graduate of Hebron Yeshiva and the LSE. Michael teaches philosophy at JFS and is an advisory on secondary schools at Pages. He also teaches Daf Yomi at Ney Yisrael Synagogue. He's a regular teacher at Central Square Minyan, Limmud, Open Talmud Project, and other organizations. And actually, funnily enough, Michael has a special connection with JW3, which I learned of from our CEO, Raymond. Michael is the first person to always be in our building on a Friday morning. He runs a class on Talmud, and it turns out that in our security cupboard, Michael, is your Talmud, along with kind of other things that we've confiscated. But your Talmud is there just in case you need it when you come to teach, which is such a great thing to have in our security cupboard. And we're so glad that you are a regular at JW3. So welcome, Michael. How are you? One second, I'm just going to unmute you, Michael.
Yeah, I'm terrific. Thank you.
Great, good to see you. So, as I said before, this program is all about unexpected, odd, quirky text in our Jewish tradition, and it's a way to show people that the Jewish tradition is so varied and multifaceted, and can be accessed by loads of different people and lots of different thinking. So, tell us where does this text that you're bringing come from? I'm going to show the screen so people can see what the text is. But give us some background and tell us about the text you've chosen.
Okay, so the text I've chosen was written by someone called Rabbi Israel Lipkin. There are many Lipkin descendants living in London today who date themselves back. He was born in 1810 and died in 1883, obviously at the age of 73. And from a surface view of his life, he looks like your standard rabbi in Lithuania, addressing his thoughts to the devout and to the pious, not too much interest in the outside world. And if you look at this text as well, it looks like a sort of fairly standard sort of religious text exhorting people to be more religious and to consider the consequences of sin. And it talks about the sinner and the punished. And in fact, it was first published in 1858 at the back of a standard pious text called Tomer Dvorah, which had established itself as a text for religious people who were seeking further inspiration. And this fitted into the general oeuvre of that kind of work. But what draws me to him and draws me to this text is that you don't have to do too much scratching away of the surface to find something completely different and absolutely astonishing. So I'd like to work my way into that by just pointing out a few things about his life. So he was born in Lithuania in a very Orthodox family. He would have had a very standard Orthodox yeshiva training. He went to Vilna when he was 12 to continue his studies. That's what he grew up as, and his first jobs were teaching in yeshiva, and that seemed to be your standard Orthodox, maybe you'd use the word Haredi, but he wouldn't recognize it, teacher, rabbi, Talmud expert, and most people would walk away after I've told them that. However, let's have a look at his biography, and we can see there's some strange things going on with it. Because in the middle of the 1850s, he's now about 47, he leaves Lithuania and goes to live in Königsberg. Now, Königsberg did have a Jewish community, but Königsberg is more famous as a university town. And it's kind of like, you know, leaving Stamford Hill and going to live in Oxford. So he makes this move, and he clearly makes connections with the university in Königsberg. His son ends up with a doctorate in Königsberg and teaching philosophy at Königsberg. So clearly the family were engaged. And it's suggesting that there's somewhat more going on. This man left his normal environment and gone to a place of contemporary thought, of contemporary thinkers, and clearly engages. At the end of his life, he spent his last years, which is just an amazing decision for someone from his background. He goes to live in Paris. And the religious spin on it is he's gone to find people who've lost their way in Paris. But I think there's people who've lost their way all over the place. He's gone to Paris because, like Königsberg, and Königsberg was the great center of the Enlightenment philosopher Immanuel Kant, he's gone to Paris, and we can see evidence from his sojourn in Paris that he knows a lot more about the French Enlightenment than we would expect. So let's just look at his life, and we can see, hey, this isn't your standard man in hat and beard. There's something really interesting going on. During this time, he sort of drops his Lipkin surname, and he adopts a surname from the town that he spent a lot of time in, which is called Salant, and he's known as Yisrael Salanta. So his biography insists that we take him, look at him with greater seriousness, because there's something really quirky going on. And in his actual thought, there's really something quirky going on, because his idea is to improve ourselves, first of all, in a moral sense, in the way we deal with other people, but also in a religious sense. To improve ourselves, we need to think about how our minds work. And he keeps on coming back to this question, how do our minds work? How do we manage to influence ourselves to become better people? And he's writing in the middle of the 19th century, and he's going to give us ideas which are only going to become really familiar when Freud starts talking about the subconscious. He talks about an element of our soul which is hidden from us, but is hugely powerful in determining our decisions. So along with others, he's pre-guessing Freud on this issue about how the psyche works. He talks about scholars of this of the soul. Scholars of the soul are definitely not rabbis. Scholars of the soul are he wouldn't have had the vocabulary of psychologists at the time, but these are people who are interested in working out how the mind works. So here we have a chap. He's living, to all intents and purposes, the standard life of an Orthodox rabbi, but he's doing other things. And in his thinking, we're seeing other ideas coming along. And what he manages to do brilliantly is he manages to address his standard audience, the audience of religious people looking for that Saturday morning inspiration from a sermon, or looking for a book to pick up to take them to the next level. But that's not his real audience. His real audience is another group of people, the people in Königsberg and the people in Paris, the people who know Enlightenment thinking. And he's saying to them, I've got a message for you lot as well. What I am inspired by is something that you too can be inspired by. Now, his problem is, however, that if he addresses one audience, he loses the other audience, and vice versa. If he addresses his religious lay people looking for inspiration, well, the yawning of the more enlightened, educated people will be absolutely devastating, and he'll lose them. And if he goes for them, the others will say, you're not the standard rabbi we're looking for. So let's have a look at the text, and you'll see, you just skim the words, you see sin and sinner and punishment. That seems to be fairly standard stuff. So how do we know that there's something going on here where he's trying to address two audiences at once? So the first sentence, this is his first published work, and his first sentence of his first published work goes like this: man is free in his imagination, but by his reason he is bound. Okay, so that sounds fairly religious. We all dream of being free, but we know we shouldn't be. We know that we're bound by Torah, by laws. So you'd switch off, but don't switch off, because any of you who've read Jean-Jacques Rousseau, and Jean-Jacques Rousseau wrote his social contract in the generation before Salanta was teaching, will remember that the first line of the social contract is, man is born free and is everywhere in chains or bound. So this is a sentence with exactly the same structure. Man, on the one hand, there's his freedom, and on the other hand, there's the fact that he's bound. And this is a parody of that opening line. Man is born free, but is everywhere in chains. Salanta says, I want to tell you, those of you who are about to switch off, who think that I'm not cool and think that I don't know about Jean-Jacques Rousseau, here I am. First sentence of any work that I've ever published, I'm parodying Jean-Jacques Rousseau. So if you've got half a brain, you'll want to hang on with me here, because I've got seriously interesting things to say about how the mind works and how we can change our lives. So he's reversing Rousseau. Rousseau has this romantic ideal that we have a right to be free, but the world enslaves us. And Salanta says, well, we don't have a right to be free. We need to control ourselves. We need to use our rationality to control ourselves to do good things. This freedom that Rousseau is proposing is illusory, it's imagination, it's not important. So having brought both audiences in, the religious audience haven't noticed this. They've never heard of Jean-Jacques Rousseau. So they just think this is another pious message, fine. And if you shuckle in the right way, it'll, we'll get the right understanding from this. And the intellectual reader of the mid-19th century is going, wow, this rabbi knows Rousseau. Well, what else does he know? What else is he going to tell us? And in the first paragraph, again, he moves on into probably intellectually the biggest issue of his day. And that would be the issue of free will. Because in France, the great scientist Laplace has come up with his idea that if you tell me enough about the world at any one point, science should, at some point, be able to tell you what the world will look like an hour after, a day after, a year after. Everything is utterly determined. Laplace was writing in the 18th century, and his idea feeds its way through thinkers like Auguste Comte and other, and obviously ultimately with Marx, this idea that for the first time, human beings were considering that we don't have free will. So he's kicked off with doffing his hat in the direction of Rousseau. I know that. And now he's saying, and I know what the big issue in the intellectual world is. The big issue is free will. And he says, right in his first paragraph, if you do something wrong, 4 lines down, you will not be able to blame anyone else. He alone will bear the consequences of his sin. And the language is, of course, the language of orthodox sermonizing. But the point he's addressing, and he's going to carry on addressing, is that we are free people. And whatever you do with your life is going to be largely your responsibility. And you can't escape responsibility by claiming that we live in a deterministic universe, as Laplace and Kant and other French intellectuals in particular, but ultimately, as I said, Marx were arguing. And Marx is a serious contemporary. So what I love about this text is it looks like it's one thing, and it's actually made its way as that one thing. There are no great intellectuals buying it. The people who are buying it today are people in yeshivot and rabbis looking for inspiration. So its cover job, the subterfuge has worked. He's managed to get it out into that audience. But behind the cover job, a little bit bubbling under the subterfuge, is this amazing text which addresses the intellectual issues of his day in a way that he's familiar with the language and familiar with the other texts. So when you crack it and you see what's inside it, you have to smile. You have to say, wow, this is something I didn't expect this man to be the author of these kinds of ideas, but he hides it so successfully that I've got to tell you, it's only you and those people only me and those people listening now who've actually discovered this deeper truth. So I'll stop there for the moment, Joe, if I may. How do you feel about the text now you've heard my interpretation?
Yeah, no, I think it's fascinating to think of Rabbi Yisrael Salanter kind of in the context of where he was, and the influences and how he tried to manage those two worlds that he was part of, and kind of cared about the world of psychotherapy in some way and philosophy. I'm interested in when I saw this text for the first time, I wanted to kind of say, before I knew it was connected to Rousseau, kind of, is this a general, is this a new thing that someone's talking about the imagination in this way? He's bringing the idea of the imagination into Judaism because of his connection to psychotherapy or the world that he was in. And does Judaism care about imagination at all?
Right. So I think even within the context of the standard view of Yisrael Salanter, he is a very novel thinker. And we need to look at the Orthodox Jewish world around him, that at the beginning of the 19th century, we see the emergence of what we today would recognize as yeshivot. The possibility you set up an institution, you say, all the best guys from around Europe, come and apply, come here, we're going to have the cream. And then you go to wealthy people around Europe and you say, well, we've got the best guys, could you fund it? And the explosion of yeshivot picks up through the 19th century on the back of that model. He comes along and he looks at these yeshivot and everyone's unbelievably optimistic. We've got the cream, we've got the best guys, we're going to change the Jewish world. Everything's going to be terrific. And he looks in the yeshivot, and the Volozhin in particular, and he sees actually nothing's changing. And on the contrary, Volozhin may be producing outstanding Talmudic students, but it's also producing outstanding secular intellectuals. The enemy at the gate has actually managed to work its way into the yeshivot, where this curriculum of learning is not working. We're getting Bialik is in Volozhin. Other important secular thinkers are finding their inspiration amongst the other within Volozhin. So he says, hold on, let's forget this learning, great, but we need to now think, what's the relationship between what we do and who we are, which is obviously a prime question in psychology. So if we do an act, how do we manage to get that act to influence and change the nature of our psyche? And that question leads him to start analyzing what is our psyche, what is a human being, and what are the drives. And that takes him, finally, back to your question, that takes him to the idea of imagination, because imagination is one of the great drivers of our psyche. And he largely considers it to be a negative force in that it takes us away from our rationality. So he's of the view that rationality is where we need to pitch our tent, and we need to try and avoid this temptation of what could be and concentrate on what should be. But what's novel in the whole, so it's novel that he's interested in imagination, but what's novel is he's interested in psyche. He's interested in how does the human mind work? How do we do an action? How can, on the one hand, we can live a life of Torah and become thoroughly immoral people? It's not impossible. There's a dissonance there between the two. How do we make sure that our actions are actually going to impact on us as people? And it's certainly since the Rambam it's a very novel approach to working out how one develops a religious life.
It's really interesting, and it seems like it was it was revolutionary for him to do it in this in this context. I'm really interested to hear, from your perspective, what he thinks about the purpose of halakha. I understand that he feels that the imagination is not what we need to be focusing on. It's the rationality. But he clearly believes that halakha in some way should influence our psyche, influence our sense of who we are, and hopefully create more moral people. But was he was he seeing something that was lacking in people who were just kind of performing halakha by rote? Like, did he not think that just by doing halakha that influences the psyche and hence changes you and makes you a better person, or did he think there had to be something in addition to that?
Well, that's exactly his point. Until he came along, the assumption is do the mitzvot and that will automatically turn you into a moral person. He noticed there's loads of people doing mitzvot and loads of them aren't moral people. So where's it gone wrong? So he thinks it's gone wrong because we're not reflecting and we're not thinking about our lives and we're not determining how to improve ourselves. So there's the bridge between action and psyche doesn't exist. He says we've got to create that bridge. That bridge is largely a process of reflection. Think about what we've done. What were the outcomes of what we've done? Were they good? Were they bad? Am I a better person as a result of that? His students advocated keeping detailed diaries of your day, so that at the end of the day, you actually reflect on, am I a better person today than I was this time yesterday? Is the world a better place today than it was this time yesterday? What's my contribution been to that? So I think he's in favor of a halachic life, but he's saying that many people are wasting their time because they're not turning that into the ultimate purpose. Is not that some a lulav should be shaken. The lulav can get through life without being shaken. The purpose is that the entire discipline turns you into a better person. And if somehow there's a disconnect between all this potentially wonderful life and who you are, then you've got to go back and you've got to start thinking again how you're doing it. And can I just point out, and it was hugely revolutionary within Orthodox Judaism, because one of his student, or a student of his student, was someone in the yeshiva in a place called Telz, and the resistance of the really conservative Orthodox students to this new attempt to introduce what they recognize as secular thinking into the whole process of becoming a better person. A gunshot was fired at him in the yeshiva in an attempt to assassinate him. That was in Telz in 1905. So I'm not saying bullets were flying, but it got to the stage in one place that someone did try and assassinate someone who was promulgating this view. So it was very new.
I mean, it does feel. I mean, that's terrible, and it feels quite high stakes. And the one thing I think about in terms of why is this high stakes is that it kind of proposes that there's something separate to halacha that we judge a kind of a good impact by. So it feels like there's a separate ethic to what the Torah is presenting. Is that what he thinks? And is that why people were firing gunshots? Is that why it was so threatening? So that's the kind of first question. But like, what was so high stakes? What made people think, he should be killed?
So there's a continuing tussle in Jewish thought. Is knowing Torah alone sufficient to guarantee an outcome of becoming a better person and creating a better society? And obviously Maimonides was the person who said, no, we've really got to look elsewhere, particularly when it comes to issues of psychology. We've got to look in books of contemporary philosophy and ancient philosophy, and that's going to bolster our Torah knowledge. Largely, particularly after the expulsion from Spain, when the whole project of synthesizing Judaism with modernity seemed to have hit the buffers, that had been lost. And other than Germany, certainly in terms of Poland and Lithuania and Russia, people had largely rejected any kind of embrace of modernity. And here he's coming along and he's saying, we're failing. We're doing all the mitzvot in the world, and we're not creating a better society, and we're not creating better people. So I'm going to import some very new, interesting secular ideas about how action impacts on psyche. And that way, we're going to be able to change the world.
That's fascinating and really interesting that he was able to see that from a distance. And it's really interesting to think about what type of communities were created at that time, and what was he critiquing. That's kind of extraneous to the text. But one thought that I have in terms of the halacha and imagination. Do you feel that? And I think, like a lot of people think about this when they think about halacha, Jewish law, that it can sometimes stifle imagination, stifle creativity. Do you think that he thinks that halacha does that, and that's important, and we should kind of focus on the rationality? Or is there space in this worldview of Rabbi Salanter's for creativity? Yeah.
Right. I don't think he thought too much about creativity. I think he thought it was a danger. But we can spin on decades and find people, particularly Rav Kook, who had a much more pluralistic view of the routes to self-improvement, and was greatly admiring of the creative arts. And I think we live in a world today that we've understood that there's no such thing as monolithic reason, that there's one way of getting to the truth. The tenets of postmodernism have in a subversive way managed to find their way into orthodox thinking, and we do understand that there's many more ways of getting to a truth, getting to an improvement of oneself than pure rationality. Or there are different rationalities, or there are different intelligences. And I personally would say, those people who miss out on the opportunity to be inspired by creativity are discarding one of God's great tools, one of the great instruments he's given us for inspiration.
Thank you. Yeah, I relate to that completely. And it's really interesting to see him not explore creativity, but explore that there are kind of another intelligence that can contribute to us being.
I think he's opening the door to broader thinking. He's saying, what I'm pushing through the door is psychology, but the door's now open, and we can push other things through that door. And in the 20th century, creativity has been one of the things that has come through the door that Salanter opened.
I think that's a beautiful image for us to end on, like that opening door. And the idea behind this program is that each kind of text that we bring opens a door to people to see that, oh, text can be this and text can be that, and there are different approaches and different people that make up the Jewish tradition. One of them is Rabbi Salanter, and different weeks we have different people share. So I really, really appreciate you opening this door to his life, and also to the context, which I think is so vital and important for people to hear. So thank you, Rabbi Michael. Do you have any last thoughts to share before we close and say Shabbat Shalom to our audience?
Well, Shabbat Shalom, and know that if I take the metaphor further, I'm not going to. The door to achievement is open, and it's down to each individual to carry through that door. Oh, the metaphor's gonna be terrible, but as you explained it, there's an opportunity to create a religion very much of your own making after Rabbi Yisrael Salanter has established the principle that we consider psychology as an important route.
Thank you. Shabbat Shalom, everyone, and thank you.